A single gunshot silenced a room full of students and stole Charlie Kirk's voice forever. As the nation wept in disbelief, one man, Keanu Reeves, stepped forward with a trembling prayer that shook America to its core. What he said next left millions in tears and changed everything. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Utah Valley University was alive with the kind of energy that only comes when young people gather, not just to learn, but to be challenged. The campus had been buzzing for days about the visit of Charlie Kirk. Flyers had been pinned on bulletin boards, reminders sent in group chats, and whispers exchanged in hallways. It wasn't just another guest speaker. For these students, it felt like history was walking into their auditorium. The room itself was electric. Students filled every seat, with latecomers standing along the walls. The stage was simple, just a lectern, a pair of chairs for the Q&A, and the university banner hanging behind it. Yet there was a weight in the air, as though everyone knew this night would be remembered. Charlie Kirk entered to warm applause. He carried no notes, no scripted lines. He never needed them. His presence wasn't polished like a politician's. It was relaxed but firm, grounded in conviction. He looked out at the sea of students, many leaning forward, phones tucked away, eager not to miss a word. Charlie smiled gently, acknowledging the crowd with a small nod before speaking. He began not with slogans, but with stories. Stories about his journey, about starting with nothing but an idea and the courage to speak it aloud. He talked about his early failures, the ridicule he endured, and how faith had been his anchor when the storms came. His words weren't crafted for applause lines. They were steady, measured, deliberate. A student in the front row raised a hand and asked the question everyone knew would come. What does it really mean to be a patriot? Charlie paused, smiled, and leaned against the lectern. He explained that being a patriot was not about shouting the loudest or demanding recognition. It was about sacrifice, courage, and telling the truth, even when it cost you something. His voice softened as he said, "It means standing when the world tells you to sit down." The students listened in silence. Another hand went up. This one was tougher. A young woman challenged him directly about free speech, asking why offensive words should be tolerated. Charlie didn't bristle or dismiss her. Instead, he leaned closer, his tone calm. He explained that free speech mattered most when it was uncomfortable. "The test of freedom," he said, "isn't in protecting the words we like, it's in protecting the words we don't." A ripple of murmurs spread across the auditorium. Even those who disagreed found themselves quietly nodding. The atmosphere was rare, almost sacred. For once, it wasn't about scrolling screens or shouting over one another. It was about listening, about wrestling with hard ideas. For many of the students, it felt like they were part of something bigger, something meaningful, something worth remembering. And then it happened. A sound ripped through the auditorium, sharp, violent, unnatural. At first, it was so out of place that no one reacted. For a split second, it was dismissed as microphone feedback or maybe a stage light crashing to the floor. But the sound carried a finality too heavy to ignore. That was no accident. It was a gunshot. The silence shattered. The sound lingered in the air for a heartbeat too long, echoing off the walls of the packed auditorium. A gasp rose from the front row, sharp and high-pitched, before turning into a scream that split the silence in two. That scream ignited panic, like a spark to dry timber. Students shot to their feet, chairs screeching across the floor as bodies pressed against each other in terror. The orderly rows dissolved into chaos. Some bolted for the exits. Others ducked beneath their seats, shielding their heads with trembling arms. The roar of panic filled the hall, a terrifying symphony of shouts, sobs, and the thunder of running feet. On stage, Charlie Kirk staggered. The strength that had carried his voice moments before seemed to vanish in an instant. His body crumpled forward, first to his knees, then collapsing fully onto the floor. His hand clawed at his chest as though trying to hold himself upright, his face twisted in shock and pain. The microphone rolled from its stand, clattering across the wooden floor with a hollow echo that somehow made the horror feel even more real. Security guards who had been casually positioned along the edges now sprinted toward the stage. Their radios crackled with frantic voices, commands lost in the roar of panic. Some pushed through the rushing crowd, trying to restore order, while others formed a protective barrier around the fallen speaker. But it was too late. The damage had been done. In the confusion, no one saw the shooter clearly. Some swore they caught a glimpse, a shadow slipping through a side exit, a faceless figure blending into the chaos. But the fear was too consuming, the motion too fast. Whoever had pulled the trigger disappeared into the night like a ghost. The students stampeded toward the exits, desperation overwhelming reason. Some stumbled and fell, only to be pulled up by strangers, who were themselves shaking and crying. The sight of young people clutching each other, dragging one another to safety, was both heartbreaking and heroic. Phones were already raised, shaky hands capturing footage that would spread across the world within minutes. In the middle of it all, Charlie lay motionless. His words about courage and truth, spoken only moments before, now hung in the air like a haunting echo. The man who had filled the room with conviction was silent, and that silence felt unbearable. Outside the auditorium, the chaos spilled into the night. Sirens blared in the distance, growing louder as emergency responders closed in. Students huddled on the lawn, many sobbing into their phones as they called parents to say they were alive. Others clung together in small groups, their eyes wide, their minds struggling to comprehend what they had just seen. Inside, the stage lights glared down on the empty chair, the toppled microphone, and the body of a man who only moments earlier had stood as a symbol of strength. The air still carried the smell of gunpowder, sharp and metallic, a bitter reminder that nothing would ever be the same again. Police flooded into the auditorium within minutes, their boots striking the floor in rapid rhythm, weapons drawn as they scanned the chaos for the unseen attacker. Flashlights pierced the darkness of corners and doorways, but the shooter was gone, swallowed by confusion. The questions began instantly. Was he still inside, or already far away? Nobody knew. Paramedics rushed the stage, kneeling beside Charlie. Their hands moved quickly, cutting through his shirt, checking his pulse, searching for signs of life. The audience, those still inside, hushed for a moment as they strained to see if he would move, if he would rise, if this nightmare could somehow end with a miracle. But the expressions on the medics' faces told another story. Grim, urgent, filled with the kind of knowledge that broke hearts before words could confirm it. Outside, the campus lawn was a scene of raw grief. Students gathered in small clusters, some trembling uncontrollably, others locked in stunned silence. A girl with mascara streaks down her cheeks whispered into her phone, "Mom, I don't know what happened. He just fell. There was this sound, and then everyone was screaming." Her words broke into sobs, and her mother's voice on the other end could be faintly heard crying too. News vans screeched to a halt along the campus perimeter. Reporters scrambled to set up cameras as police erected barricades. The flashing red and blue of emergency lights turned the night into a kaleidoscope of dread. Helicopters thumped overhead, searchlights slicing through the air as though justice could be found in the shadows. Inside homes across the nation, television screens flickered with breaking news banners. Charlie Kirk, shot at Utah Valley University. The words scrolled across the bottom of the screen in heavy, urgent font. For many families, the first reaction was disbelief. A father sitting at his dinner table shook his head and muttered, "This has to be a mistake. This can't be real." But then came the shaky cell phone footage, students screaming, chairs overturned, Charlie collapsing under the stage lights. Denial melted into horror. In that single night, what had begun as a hopeful conversation about courage and freedom turned into a wound in the heart of America. Every student who had been present would remember the sound, the panic, and the sight of a man falling when moments before he had stood as a voice of conviction. Every parent who received a trembling call from their child would remember the fear that ran cold through their veins. And every American who saw the images replayed endlessly on screens would feel as though something sacred had been stolen. The auditorium, once filled with eager voices, was now a crime scene. Tape stretched across its doors. Officers moved methodically, documenting the wreckage of a night that had turned to tragedy. The microphone still lay on its side, a haunting reminder of words left unfinished. Somewhere out there, the shooter vanished into darkness, leaving behind devastation, questions, and a silence that screamed louder than any sound. And in that silence, grief spread like wildfire, preparing the stage for the prayer and the voice of a man who had lost a friend and would soon call a nation to weep together. The first alerts appeared within minutes. A student, still shaking, posted a grainy clip to social media, showing the moment the gunshot echoed through the auditorium. The sound was jagged, unnatural, followed by screaming and the sight of hundreds rushing for the exits. Within seconds, the video spread like wildfire. Phones across dorm rooms, living rooms, and workplaces buzzed with the same words, "Charlie Kirk shot." At first, many refused to believe it. The internet was full of hoaxes, and headlines often exaggerated tragedy. Parents stared at their glowing screens, whispering to each other, "This has to be fake. It can't be real." But the footage kept multiplying. Dozens of angles, each one raw and terrifying, confirmed what no one wanted to accept. It wasn't a rumor. It was reality. In homes across America, evening dinners froze in place. Families who had been laughing over the clatter of plates fell silent, forks suspended in midair. Televisions were switched from sitcoms to news channels. Anchors, their voices heavy with restrained emotion, repeated the same words. "We are receiving reports that Charlie Kirk has been shot at Utah Valley University. His condition remains unknown." In small towns where people still gathered for weeknight potlucks or Bible studies, the news spread mouth to mouth. Someone's phone would buzz, and within seconds, the room was hushed. Friends crowding around the small screen, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding hundreds of miles away. On college campuses, young people stared at their phones in shock. Even those who had often disagreed with Charlie's ideas felt a pit in their stomachs. It wasn't just the shooting of a public figure. It was the shooting of a man who had dared to stand in front of students and speak openly. For many, it felt like an attack not only on a person, but on the very idea of conversation itself. In New York, a bartender muted the music in his crowded bar when a breaking news banner scrolled across the television. Patrons leaned in, their drinks untouched, as the footage played again and again. Some groaned in disbelief, others whispered prayers. The bar, usually filled with noise, grew uncharacteristically quiet. In a quiet suburb of Texas, a father placed his hand on his son's shoulder as they watched the news together. "You see this?" he said softly. "That's what courage costs sometimes." His son, just 16, swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the screen. Church bells rang in a small town in Ohio, though it wasn't Sunday and no service was scheduled. A pastor, having heard the news, unlocked the doors and placed a handwritten sign outside. "Prayer vigil tonight. All are welcome." People trickled in before the first reporters could even confirm Charlie's condition. Some knelt in pews, tears streaming down their faces. Others sat in silence, hands folded, trying to find words that wouldn't come. The nation wasn't just watching. The nation was holding its breath. Every second without an update felt like hours. Every new alert brought a wave of fear. Would Charlie live? Or was America witnessing the silencing of a voice that had spoken for millions? The disbelief began to fracture as more footage reached television screens. Networks replayed shaky cell phone videos, looping the moment the crowd screamed, the stage lights glaring down on Charlie as his body gave way. The anchors struggled to keep their composure, their voices low, their expressions grave. Each replay drove the reality deeper, chiseling away at the denial that people clung to in those first minutes. Across America, tears fell in homes that had never met Charlie Kirk, but had felt his presence through a screen, a book, or a speech. Mothers sat with hands pressed against their lips, fathers shook their heads with heavy silence, and children asked questions their parents couldn't answer. For many families, It wasn't just grief, it was fear. If such violence could strike in a place of learning, what place was safe anymore? In California, a group of college students gathered in a dorm lounge. Some of them had debated fiercely against Charlie's ideas online, yet they sat shoulder to shoulder, their eyes wide with shock. One young man whispered, "I disagreed with everything he said, but no one deserves this." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, even ideological divisions gave way to shared sorrow. In the Midwest, a truck stop diner paused as every television switched to the news. Truckers, waitresses, and travelers all turned their attention to the glowing screens. The clinking of silverware stopped. The only sound was the steady hum of refrigerators in the back. When the footage replayed, one older man in a baseball cap muttered, "That could have been my grandson sitting there." Another placed a hand on his shoulder, and both men bowed their heads quietly. Churches that had been locked for the night flung their doors wide open. Word spread quickly through neighborhoods, and candles appeared in hands as people walked in silence toward the sanctuary. In towns from Kentucky to Arizona, pastors stood at pulpits without prepared sermons, leading congregations in impromptu prayer. Some spoke with trembling voices, others could only weep. The sound of whispered prayers echoed against the walls, mixing with the quiet sobs of those who couldn't find words at all. Meanwhile, social media boiled with grief and rage. Hashtags surged to the top within minutes. Number "Pray for Charlie," number "Justice for Charlie." Strangers who had never interacted before found themselves typing the same words of heartbreak, sharing Bible verses, or posting the phrase, "Not him. Not like this." The comment sections were filled with virtual embraces, strangers consoling strangers, and a collective cry that was too vast to ignore. In Washington, D.C., lights still burned in government offices as aides passed phones back and forth, relaying fragments of information. Lawmakers who had sparred bitterly with Charlie in the public arena now sat in stunned silence. Some prayed quietly at their desks, while others reached out to colleagues across the aisle. For a rare moment, the usual hostility of politics gave way to something deeper, a recognition that a voice had been violently taken, and America itself felt the loss. The night grew heavier with each passing hour. The nation was still waiting, still hoping for a sliver of good news, but with every new report, the weight of tragedy pressed harder against the chest of a grieving country. As the night deepened, America seemed to move in unison. In living rooms, families that had never prayed together before now held hands, bowing their heads as the news anchor spoke. In city apartments, candles flickered against windowsills, small flames pushing back the darkness. Across highways, drivers pulled into rest stops to check their phones, reading headlines again and again, as if the repetition might make the words change. The silence in homes was unlike any ordinary evening silence. It was the kind that carried weight, pressing against every heartbeat. The sound of televisions filled the void, with anchors struggling to balance their duty to inform with the raw humanity of what they were reporting. Some broke down mid-broadcast, their voices catching, eyes glistening as they whispered, "We will update you as soon as we know more." In Boston, a mother and her teenage daughter sat together on the couch. The daughter scrolled through TikTok, where live videos from students at Utah Valley University had already amassed millions of views. One clip showed a trembling hand filming the chaos, the sound of screams echoing through the hall. The daughter's eyes watered as she turned to her mother and asked, "Why would someone do this?" The mother had no answer. She only pulled her daughter closer, tears spilling, onto her shoulder. In the heartland, farmers who had risen early to work now stayed awake long into the night, gathered around radios and glowing screens in their kitchens. The conversations were quiet, fragmented, filled with sighs and whispers. Some spoke of faith, others of fear, but all carried the same heavy sorrow. The shooting of Charlie Kirk wasn't just an attack on one man, it was felt as an attack on something shared, something sacred. Outside the university, a vigil began almost without planning. Students who had fled in terror hours earlier returned, carrying candles, their faces pale and solemn. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising in prayer. Hymns like "Amazing Grace" drifted into the night air. mixing with the low murmur of sobbing. Reporters captured the scene, their cameras panning across the faces of young men and women who had come not to protest, but to mourn. By midnight, the ripple had spread nationwide. Churches filled with people. Parks in major cities saw strangers gather spontaneously, holding hands and lifting candles. Some carried handmade signs with words hastily written in marker. "We will not forget. Pray for Charlie. America weeps." In those hours, the usual chatter of politics and division seemed to vanish. Social media timelines that were often filled with argument and noise now carried verses of scripture, lines of poetry, and photographs of candlelight. Across every platform, a single truth rang clear. The nation was in mourning, and as the long night stretched on, America remained suspended in grief, waiting for a voice to break the silence, waiting for someone who could help them make sense of a tragedy that words alone could never fully capture. The editing studio in Los Angeles was dimly lit, the only glow coming from the screen where Keanu Reeves sat hunched forward in quiet concentration. It was late, and the city outside buzzed faintly in the distance, but inside the room there was silence, broken only by the soft clicks of the keyboard. On the screen, footage rolled from a small charity documentary he had been quietly funding. It told the story of children in an after-school program in South Central, a place where hope often flickered like a fragile flame. Keanu leaned forward, studying the footage carefully, his brow furrowed. He wanted the story told right. It wasn't about him, it never was. It was about giving people light, even in the darkest places. The studio door creaked open, though Keanu barely noticed. He thought it was just another technician coming in to adjust equipment, but when his assistant stepped inside, her footsteps hesitated. He turned slightly and caught the look on her face. She was pale, her lips pressed tight, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. Something in the air shifted, heavy and sharp, a weight pressing against the walls of the quiet room. "Keanu," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "You need to see this." He straightened slowly, confusion etching into his calm features. She held the phone out, the screen glowing with a headline so stark it seemed unreal. Charlie Kirk, shot at Utah Valley University. Beneath the words, shaky video played, showing screaming students and blurred images of a body on the stage. For a moment, Keanu did not move. His eyes scanned the headline again, as if his mind refused to register what he was seeing. His face, usually composed and steady even in difficult moments, cracked under the weight of disbelief. His lips parted, but no words came. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the computer still playing the charity footage in the background. "No," he finally breathed, his voice hoarse. His hand reached for the phone, gripping it as though by holding it he might change the reality it carried. The video replayed, each second cutting deeper. He saw the panic, the terror, the collapse on stage. He couldn't look away, even as his chest tightened and his throat closed with grief. The assistant stood frozen, unsure whether to speak or leave him to his silence. But Keanu whispered again, this time so faint it was almost a prayer. "Not Charlie, please, no." The words fell heavy, as if torn from the depths of his soul. His eyes glistened, the rawness of the moment breaking through the calm exterior the world so often admired. For years he had endured personal losses with quiet dignity, rarely showing his pain. But this was different. This was fresh. This was sudden. And this was a friend. Keanu set the phone down on the desk, but his eyes stayed locked on it, as if the words might vanish if he looked away. His hands trembled slightly as he pressed his palms together, resting his chin against them. A part of him wanted to believe it was just a cruel mistake, a false headline, one of those internet hoaxes that spread like fire. But the videos, the screams, the faces of terrified students, none of it could be faked. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The memories rushed in uninvited, colliding with the present, until the studio around him seemed to blur. He remembered the last time he had spoken to Charlie. It had been late at night, just a week earlier. Keanu had been sitting in his kitchen with a cup of tea, unable to sleep, when Charlie called, On the other end of the line, Charlie's voice was steady but warm. They had talked about the state of the world, about the growing divisions, about how people seemed to be losing the ability to listen to one another. Keanu had admitted quietly that sometimes he felt powerless, even with all his fame, even with his resources. "I'm just an actor," he had said, his voice low, almost ashamed. Charlie had responded without hesitation. "No, Keanu, you're more than that. You're a man with influence, with integrity. People listen to you because they know you're real. That matters. Don't underestimate the power of being authentic in a world that's drowning in pretense." The words came back now like a haunting echo. Keanu's throat tightened as he remembered how Charlie had ended that call with prayer. Charlie had prayed over him, over his family, over the people they both tried in their own ways to reach. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't showy. It was genuine. And when the call ended, Keanu had felt something lift, a quiet reassurance that lingered long after the line went silent. Now, sitting in the dim glow of the editing room, that memory felt like a final gift. He could still hear Charlie's voice, calm and certain. "Don't stop hoping, brother. Even in the darkest times, hope is the only thing that keeps us moving forward." The assistant shifted nervously, her eyes wet as she stood near the door. She wanted to say something comforting, but knew words would be hollow. Keanu lifted his hand gently, signaling that he needed a moment alone. She nodded and slipped out of the room, leaving him with the heavy silence of grief. Keanu closed his eyes, and the words slipped out again, quieter this time, trembling with sorrow. "Not Charlie, please, not him." The silence inside the studio pressed down like a weight, thicker than the night outside. Keanu sat motionless, staring at the darkened phone screen as if it still carried the headline that had broken him. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes red with tears he was trying to hold back. For years he had carried loss with a quiet endurance, never making a spectacle of his grief. But tonight, alone in that dim room, he felt the edges of his strength crumble. He pushed himself up from the chair and began pacing slowly across the studio floor. The footage on the monitor still played, showing smiling children from the charity program, their laughter filling the speakers. The contrast was unbearable. Just hours ago, he had been focused on stories of hope. Now he was drowning in the story of loss. He pressed his hand against the console to steady himself, his mind returning again to Charlie's last words during that late-night call. Charlie had told him, "Keep believing in people, even when they let you down. Faith in humanity isn't naive, it's necessary." The words cut deeply now, like a farewell he had never recognized at the time. Keanu sank into a chair in the corner of the room, his hands covering his face. For a long moment, there was only silence, broken by the sound of his uneven breathing. Then he whispered into the empty room, the words trembling out like a prayer. "God, not him. Please, not Charlie. Take anything else, but not him." He sat in that posture, head bowed, for what felt like hours. His thoughts ran in circles, memories of laughter, of conversations that had gone late into the night, of moments when Charlie's encouragement had kept him steady. He thought of the students who had been in that auditorium, of the fear they must have felt, of the image they would never forget. He thought of Charlie's wife and children, suddenly facing a future that had been ripped from them in an instant. The weight of it all pressed against his chest until it felt difficult to breathe. And yet, beneath the grief, another feeling began to stir, an ache that was more than pain. It was a pull, a call. He knew the world would be watching in the coming days. They would be waiting for words from leaders, from politicians, from celebrities. But he also knew that none of that mattered right now. What mattered was speaking as a friend. Keanu lifted his head slowly, his eyes still wet, but his voice steadier than before. "If I don't speak, his light goes out. If I do, maybe it can shine again." The words were spoken only to himself, but in that quiet studio, they marked the beginning of something he had not yet fully realized, a moment when his grief would not remain private. Soon, it would become the grief of a nation. The memory came back to Keanu with startling clarity, as though the years between had collapsed in an instant. He had first met Charlie Kirk at a benefit dinner for veterans in Washington, D.C. It had been one of those evenings filled with powerful names and polished speeches, the kind of event where most people angled for photographs or whispered about influence. Keanu never liked those rooms. He preferred quiet corners, slipping in and out without much notice. That night, however, something different happened. He remembered standing near the back of the ballroom, listening as speakers took their turns. The chandeliers glowed warmly overhead, the tables covered with fine linens and place cards bearing names of politicians, donors, and celebrities. Keanu had been invited because of a recent contribution he had made to a foundation supporting wounded warriors. He hadn't expected to stay long. He was already looking toward the door when a young man with sharp eyes and an open expression walked toward him. It was Charlie. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness in the way he introduced himself. He didn't fawn over Keanu's fame, didn't mention movies, didn't ask for a photograph. Instead, he extended his hand and said, "I just wanted to thank you for supporting veterans." That matters more than most people realize. The sincerity in his voice caught Keanu off guard. He was used to people treating him like a symbol, a star, someone untouchable. Charlie didn't. He looked at him as though he were simply another man in the room, someone trying in his own way to do what was right. That humility struck Keanu harder than he could have explained. They ended up sitting together at one of the round tables toward the side of the room. The conversation didn't start with politics or speeches. It started with stories of family. Charlie spoke about his parents, about the values they had instilled in him, about the importance of faith. Keanu listened, quietly moved by how grounded and genuine he seemed. At one point during dinner, Charlie bowed his head to say grace. Keanu noticed how unforced it was, how natural. It wasn't for display, it was real. That authenticity was something he rarely saw in rooms like this. He felt himself leaning in, wanting to know more about what gave this young man such conviction. When the evening ended, most people left with handshakes and business cards. Keanu left with something else, a feeling that he had just met someone different, someone who wasn't afraid to live out his beliefs without apology. It was the beginning of a friendship that would grow into something Keanu never expected. A bond closer than blood, forged in late-night calls, shared prayers, and honest talks about the soul of a nation. After that dinner, their paths continued to cross in unexpected ways. Keanu would fly into a city for a quiet charity event or a film shoot, and somehow Charlie was there too, either speaking to students or meeting with community leaders. At first, their conversations were brief, polite exchanges at the edge of crowded rooms. But little by little, those small talks turned into phone calls, and the phone calls grew into late-night conversations that sometimes stretched for hours. What surprised Keanu most was how little Charlie cared about surface things. He never asked about Hollywood gossip or tried to leverage Keanu's fame for his cause. Instead, he asked questions about life, about grief, about meaning. Keanu found himself opening up in ways he rarely did with anyone. He spoke of his own private struggles, of the loved ones he had lost, of the quiet ache that never seemed to leave him. He expected polite nods or quick changes of subject, but Charlie listened, really listened. More than once, when Keanu admitted feeling the weight of despair pressing down, Charlie answered not with platitudes, but with prayer. He would pause, his voice steady, and pray aloud over the phone. Those moments were unlike anything Keanu had experienced before. The world knew him as stoic, as private, as someone who endured pain without complaint. But in those late-night calls, when Charlie prayed for him, he felt something shift inside, a reminder that even in sorrow, he was not alone. Their talks often circled back to the future of America. Keanu had always loved the country that had given him opportunity, but he carried questions about its divisions, its anger, its uncertainty. Charlie spoke with conviction, yet always with hope. He believed deeply that faith could still guide a broken nation back to strength. He told Keanu once, "The world doesn't need more perfect people. It needs real ones who won't give up." That line etched itself into Keanu's heart. Over time, their friendship took on the cadence of brotherhood. They would text quick notes before events, little reminders of encouragement. Charlie would send verses from scripture or short phrases like, "Stay strong, brother." Keanu would answer with gratitude, surprised at how much those small gestures steadied him. For a man who had built walls around his grief for so many years, this friendship became a lifeline. It was during one of those calls, after midnight, that Keanu found himself saying words he had never spoken about anyone before. "You're the brother I never expected, Charlie," he admitted softly. "But maybe you're the one I needed." The line hung in the air, and Charlie chuckled gently before answering, "Then let's walk like brothers. Neither of us should carry this alone." Their friendship deepened in ways that surprised both of them. For Keanu, who had spent so much of his life retreating into quiet corners, Charlie became a voice that called him outward. When work on a film set ended late and loneliness crept in, Charlie would pick up the phone, even if it was past midnight where he was. He would ask how Keanu was doing, not as a celebrity, but as a man, as a brother. Charlie's humility never faded. He could have filled conversations with stories of his movement, his speeches, his public victories. Instead, he often asked questions about Keanu's private world. How was his sister? How were the children in the charities he supported? Was he finding time for rest, for peace? That simple attentiveness left a mark on Keanu. In a world obsessed with spotlight and recognition, Charlie seemed to live for something else, something higher, something eternal. There were moments when they laughed like boys again. Keanu remembered one evening when they argued over who made the best cheeseburger in Los Angeles. Charlie swore by a small diner tucked away on the east side. Keanu insisted it was a quiet place he had discovered near the ocean. They promised to test each other's claims, and when they finally did, the laughter they shared over greasy paper wrappers felt like freedom. But there were also solemn moments that carved their bond even deeper. Keanu once confided that he sometimes questioned whether his life had real meaning beyond the screen. Charlie answered without hesitation, "Your life matters because you live it with humility. You treat people as equals, no matter who they are. That's rare, and it's powerful." For a man who had always tried to stay grounded despite fame, those words carried weight that stayed with Keanu long after the call ended. Faith wove through their conversations, like a thread that bound them together. Charlie's prayers became a constant in Keanu's life, whether spoken aloud or sent in a brief message. And though Keanu's own faith had often been private, even uncertain, he found himself moved by Charlie's certainty. There was strength in it, a steady light that illuminated his path in ways he couldn't explain. As the years passed, their friendship became less about circumstance and more about calling. They didn't just talk about themselves. They talked about America, about the people who felt unheard, about what it meant to hold on to hope in a world that often chose despair. Charlie spoke with fire, Keanu with quiet conviction, but together their voices found harmony. Looking back now, in the aftermath of tragedy, Keanu could only describe him one way. Charlie wasn't just a friend. He was the brother he never expected, but the one he truly needed. The Oval Office was bathed in a somber glow that evening, the soft light of lamps casting long shadows across the historic room. The president sat behind the resolute desk, his hands folded tightly, his face lined with grief but also steel. Cameras were set up silently, their lenses fixed on him as technicians made final adjustments. The weight of the moment was heavy enough to silence even the busiest aides. No one dared to whisper. When the red light above the main camera flicked on, millions of Americans turned their attention to the screen. The president began slowly, his tone low and deliberate, each word carrying the gravity of a nation in mourning. "My fellow Americans," he said, pausing briefly as though steadying his voice. "Tonight, we face a sorrow that pierces to the very soul of this nation." The brutal attack on Charlie Kirk was not only an attack on a man, but an attack on the very heart of our freedom. The words reverberated across living rooms, church halls, and crowded bars. Families leaned closer to their televisions, listening not just for information, but for reassurance. In small towns, People huddled together in firehouses and school gyms, where projectors displayed the broadcast. In city apartments, solitary figures sat with their heads bowed, eyes fixed on the screen. The president continued, his expression hardening with each sentence. Charlie Kirk stood for something larger than himself. He stood for the right of every American to speak freely without fear, to gather without violence, to live in courage rather than in silence. To strike him down was an act of cowardice. It was an assault on America's soul. The camera panned slightly, capturing the tightness of his jaw, the way his hands pressed firmly against the desk. His voice dropped lower, thick with restrained anger. We will not let this crime go unanswered. There is no darkness deep enough, no place hidden enough where those responsible can escape justice. We will find them, and when we do, justice will be swift. In homes across the country, people nodded through their tears. For a brief moment, there was comfort in the firm tone, the promise of resolve. Yet even as the president's words carried determination, they could not soften the grief. Mothers still wept quietly on their couches. Fathers still stared at the floor, fists clenched. Young people who had been in the auditorium still replayed the nightmare in their minds, no speech able to erase the sound of that gunshot. The broadcast ended after less than 15 minutes, the president lowering his eyes as the cameras cut to black. The nation had heard its leader, and the determination had steadied them. But beneath it, another feeling grew. America wanted to hear not only from its politicians, but from someone who had truly known Charlie as a friend. Someone whose grief was not scripted, whose tears were not rehearsed. And more hearts turned to Keanu Reeves. When the president's address concluded, the nation sat in silence for a long moment. The broadcast had ended, but the weight of his words lingered. Television anchors came back on screen, their expressions grave, their voices subdued. They repeated key phrases for emphasis: an assault on America's soul, justice will be swift. Analysts spoke about unity, about courage, about law enforcement mobilizing. But even as the commentary rolled on, many viewers found themselves staring blankly, unable to process more. In homes across the Midwest, people murmured their approval at the president's firmness. Fathers nodded solemnly. Mothers whispered, "Good," when he promised justice. But after the first waves of reassurance passed, the grief came back heavier. The president's authority could promise accountability, but it could not fill the empty chair at Charlie Kirk's dinner table. It could not comfort the children who would now grow up without their father's laughter. In churches, pastors replayed the address on projectors for congregations who had gathered spontaneously. They prayed after, voices rising in the dim sanctuaries, some with anger, some with tears. The president's words carried strength, but the people needed something deeper than strength. They needed comfort. Across social media, reactions came in torrents. Some posted clips of the president vowing justice, sharing them with captions like, "We stand together." Others shared videos of the vigil outside Utah Valley University, where students lit candles and sang hymns. But among the millions of posts, a recurring theme began to appear. People were tagging one name. They weren't asking for a press release or another official statement. They were asking, almost pleading, for Keanu Reeves to speak. It surprised even those who typed it. Why Keanu? He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a pastor. He wasn't a man of speeches. But America knew about his bond with Charlie. Their conversations had been glimpsed in interviews, their friendship clear in the way they spoke about one another. And unlike political figures, Keanu was seen as someone real, someone unfiltered, a man who had carried his own sorrows with quiet dignity. In New York, a television host said it aloud during a live panel. "I think people are waiting to hear from Keanu Reeves. This was personal for him. Sometimes you need to hear grief in its truest form, not through policy, but through tears." The other panelists nodded, one adding softly, "He knew Charlie, not as a figure, but as a brother." The idea spread quickly. Posts multiplied. News outlets replayed old clips of Keanu and Charlie at events, showing their camaraderie. The bond was undeniable. And as the night deepened, America's focus began shifting. The president had given determination, but now the nation longed for something else, for a human voice that spoke not from authority, but from the heart. As midnight passed, the Oval Office address, replayed on every major channel, clips were edited into short sound bites for endless circulation online. But while the phrases stirred determination, the nation's grief still hung heavy, unresolved. It was as if Americans had heard from their leader, but were still waiting for someone who could truly share the burden of their pain. In Los Angeles, reporters stationed outside Keanu Reeves' home spoke in hushed tones, their breath visible in the cool night air. They didn't expect a statement right away. He was private, reserved, but they knew the bond he shared with Charlie. "If anyone can capture what this moment means," one correspondent said softly to the camera, "it may be Keanu." Across the country, the thought echoed. In living rooms, people spoke it aloud. What will Keanu say? In college dorms, students who had once debated Charlie's views now scrolled through social media, searching for signs of his friend's response. On street corners where vigils flickered with candlelight, strangers mentioned his name in conversations, their eyes wet with tears. Part of it was the authenticity he carried. America had watched Keanu endure loss before, carrying his grief with quiet grace. He had never sought pity, never turned sorrow into spectacle, and that was precisely why people trusted him. They believed his words would not be polished or rehearsed. They would come from the raw place of love and pain where truth always lives. At a small diner in Kansas, a group of veterans watched highlights of the president's address. One of them shook his head slowly and said, "He spoke well, but I'll be honest, what I want now is to hear Keanu pray. I think that's what this country needs." Around the table, others nodded, and the idea spread like wildfire, whispered from person to person. In Washington, aides who had sat through the Oval Office broadcast noted the same thing on their feeds. Posts calling for Keanu's voice were trending, millions, tagging his name with words like, "Speak, brother, and we need you." Even lawmakers admitted privately that his voice might carry more weight in this moment than any political statement. By dawn, America had absorbed the president's determination. But beneath the promise of justice, people longed for something deeper. They were waiting for Keanu Reeves, not the movie star, not the celebrity, but the man who had loved Charlie Kirk as a brother. They needed his grief to mirror their own. They needed his prayer to become their prayer. The house was dark except for a single lamp that burned low in the corner of Keanu Reeves's living room. The city outside still hummed with restless traffic, but within those walls there was only silence, heavy and unyielding. His phone sat on the table in front of him, buzzing every few seconds with new messages. He didn't reach for it. He just sat with his hands clasped together, staring at the shadows on the wall. The flood of messages had been relentless since the moment the news broke. Heads of state had sent their condolences. Journalists begged for a statement, each claiming they would respect his privacy, but all pressing with the same urgency. Friends from the film industry texted their heartbreak. And then there were the thousands upon thousands of ordinary people, people who had never met him, never shared a conversation, yet somehow believed he was the one who could carry their grief. Keanu let the phone buzz. He had never been one to rush into the spotlight. Silence was his shield, his way of surviving the storms of fame. But tonight, the silence felt different. It wasn't protecting him, it was suffocating him. On the screen, one message finally forced his hand. It was from a young student who had been in the auditorium at Utah Valley University. The words were shaky, the grammar broken, but the plea cut deeper than anything else he had read. "Please, Mr. Reeves, we don't know who else to turn to. Say something. Pray with us. Make us believe again." Keanu closed his eyes and felt the weight of the words press against him. It wasn't about his career or his image. It wasn't about politics. It was about grief. People believed he could help carry it, even if only for a moment. He rose slowly and walked to the window. The Los Angeles skyline glittered faintly under a heavy sky. In the distance, he could hear faint sirens, a reminder that the world outside never stopped moving. But inside, time felt frozen. His reflection in the glass looked tired, his shoulders slumped. For a man who had lived through so many private losses, this was the first time he felt the grief of a nation pressing on him personally. And then, as if called from memory, Charlie's voice came back to him. A conversation they had late one night after an event in Chicago. Charlie had leaned in, his tone warm and insistent. "Keanu, you've touched millions with your films. Imagine what your prayers could do. Don't hide from that. Use it." The memory broke something inside him. His throat tightened, his chest heavy with both sorrow and clarity. Charlie's words weren't meant as flattery. They had been a challenge, a gentle urging toward courage. And now, with Charlie gone, that challenge became a command he could not ignore. Keanu realized this moment was no longer about choice. It was about duty. He would have to speak not as an actor, not as a celebrity, but as a brother in grief, as a friend. Keanu sat back down, running his hand over his face, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. The phone on the table continued its endless hum, but now he picked it up and scrolled through the avalanche of messages. There were calls from world leaders, invitations from major networks to appear on live broadcasts, carefully worded emails from advisors suggesting prepared statements, but none of it felt right. Then he came across a different kind of message. A video, recorded by a mother sitting at her kitchen table with her young son beside her. Her voice shook as she spoke. "Charlie meant the world to us. We watched him every week. My son keeps asking me why God let this happen. I don't have answers. But if you prayed with us, Mr. Reeves, I think it would help him believe there's still good in the world." The boy leaned into the frame then, clutching a worn Bible, his eyes wide and uncertain. Keanu stopped the video halfway through, unable to watch more. His heart ached. The requests weren't just from strangers, they were from families searching for hope, from children too young to understand but old enough to feel the void. He set the phone down again, his hands trembling. Part of him wanted to remain silent, to avoid the crushing responsibility of carrying a nation's grief on his shoulders. Silence had always been his refuge, his way of preserving the sacred parts of his soul. But deep down, he knew silence would betray the very friendship he was mourning. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Memories began to surface, nights when Charlie called him after events, weary but still hopeful. Charlie had spoken often about the loneliness of standing for truth, the weight of being misunderstood. "Sometimes I think I'm speaking into a storm," Charlie had once confessed. "But then I remember, storms don't last forever. God does." Keanu had admired that strength, the ability to keep believing in light, even when surrounded by darkness. And now it was his turn to carry that light. He didn't know if he had Charlie's eloquence or his boldness, but he had his honesty. That had always been enough in his films, in his life. Maybe it would be enough now. He opened his eyes again, staring at the darkened room. The lamp flickered softly. His phone buzzed once more, the screen lighting up with new messages, millions of voices pressing in, waiting, pleading. He felt the weight of all those expectations, not as a burden to run from, but as a calling to rise toward. For the first time since the tragedy, Keanu bowed his head, whispering words only he could hear. "Charlie, help me find the strength to do this. If I can be a voice tonight, let it be for you." The night stretched on, the clock ticking past 2 in the morning. Yet Keanu remained seated in the same chair. His body was tired, but his mind was sharp with unease. Every few minutes, he rose and walked the room, his bare feet silent against the hardwood floor, then sat again, caught between stillness and urgency. The question haunted him. What could he possibly say to meet this moment? He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the silent phone that lay beside him. In the corner of his mind, he could almost hear Charlie's voice again, calm and steady, reminding him of truths they had shared. "It's not about the perfect words, brother," Charlie had told him once. "It's about speaking from the heart. People recognize honesty when they hear it." Keanu let those words sink in. He had never considered himself a man of speeches, but perhaps that was what gave him a chance to reach people. He wouldn't craft a polished address. He wouldn't hide behind carefully scripted lines. He would speak simply, The way Charlie had lived direct, heartfelt, and unashamed. The decision settled into him like a quiet flame. He knew what he had to do. He would speak, not tomorrow, not in a week, but soon, because America wasn't just waiting, it was aching. The moment could not pass without a voice that spoke with both grief and faith. He walked back to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The city lay stretched before him, glowing in fragments under the haze of night. Somewhere out there, millions of people were awake just like him, sitting in silence, scrolling through their phones, searching for something to cling to. He imagined the families holding candles at vigils, the college students whispering prayers in dorm rooms, the children asking their parents impossible questions. They weren't waiting for a star to comfort them. They were waiting for a friend to sit beside them in their grief. Keanu returned to his chair, picked up his phone, and finally opened the recording app. For a moment, his thumb hovered over the red button. His chest tightened as though the weight of the nation's sorrow pressed against his ribs. Then he took a deep breath, his voice trembling but firm in the quiet. "Charlie was my brother," he whispered into the darkness, as if rehearsing for the world to hear. "And tonight, I'll carry his light with all of you." The words were raw, unfinished, but they were real. And for the first time since the tragedy, Keanu felt clarity. He knew the time had come. He would speak not as an actor, not as a public figure, but as a friend mourning a brother. The world was waiting, and he was ready to answer. The journal lay open on the table, its worn leather cover creased from years of use. Keanu had carried it through countless seasons of his life, filling its pages with reflections, sketches, and the quiet thoughts he never shared publicly. Tonight, though, his hand trembled as he held the pen. The lines on the page were empty, demanding words he wasn't sure he could write. He pressed the tip of the pen down and managed a single sentence. "Charlie was my brother." The ink smudged slightly as his hand shook. He stared at the words for a long moment, then wrote another line. "The world lost him, but heaven gained him." His handwriting was uneven, jagged, the letters almost collapsing under the weight of his grief. Every sentence he wrote felt less like a statement and more like a prayer. The words were not carefully constructed or rehearsed. They spilled onto the paper as whispers of his heart. Sometimes he stopped mid-sentence, unable to continue, and his pen hovered above the page until a new phrase formed. Other times, tears blurred the ink, staining the paper in uneven blotches. On the table beside the journal lay a folded slip of paper, yellowed at the edges from being carried in his wallet for years. It was a Bible passage Charlie had once sent him during a particularly difficult season. Keanu had been mourning a private loss then, weighed down by loneliness. Late one night, Charlie had texted him, followed the next day, with this verse written neatly on paper when they met. Psalm 34:18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Keanu unfolded it now, his hand brushing over the faded words. He read it again and again, letting the truth sink into his spirit. He whispered it softly, his voice cracking, as though Charlie himself were speaking it to him once more. The journal page filled slowly. He wrote about the first time Charlie had prayed for him, the way his voice had been steady and strong even as Keanu's own had faltered. He wrote about their conversations that stretched into the night, about hope, about courage, about America's future. Each memory hurt, but it also anchored him, reminding him that this tribute was not about performance, it was about honesty. He stopped writing and leaned back in his chair. The lamp flickered faintly above him, casting shadows across the room. The silence pressed in heavy, and in that stillness, Keanu felt the weight of the task settle on him fully. He knew the world was waiting, but more than that, he knew Charlie's family was waiting. And so, with a deep breath, he placed the pen down, slid the journal aside, and slowly lowered himself to his knees on the floor. The hardwood floor was cool against his knees as Keanu bowed his head. His hands pressed together, fingers trembling, the journal still open on the table above him. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the uneven rhythm of his breathing. He tried to form words, but for a long time nothing came. His lips parted, yet only a whisper escaped. God, give me the strength to do this. It was not eloquent, not polished, but it was real. He stayed there in silence, waiting, as though the stillness itself might offer an answer. Every doubt pressed in on him. What if he failed? What if he spoke and it wasn't enough? What if his grief made him stumble, his voice breaking before the world? These thoughts swirled like storms inside him, threatening to drown the courage he was struggling to find. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to his folded hands, and whispered again, "I can't do this without you." Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. His body ached from kneeling, but he didn't move. Instead, his mind returned to the words Charlie had written on that slip of paper. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted." Keanu repeated it again and again, almost like a mantra. Each time, it steadied him a little more, pulling him back from the edge of despair. Finally, he rose to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate. He sat back at the table and pulled the journal closer. His eyes scanned the shaky sentences he had written earlier, and he felt unsatisfied. The words seemed too small for the weight of what he needed to express. But as he stared at them, he realized they weren't supposed to be perfect. They were supposed to be human. He picked up the pen again and continued writing, this time letting the sentences flow without hesitation. He wrote about the last time he and Charlie had spoken, how Charlie's laugh had filled the line when Keanu shared a story from his film set, how the conversation had shifted into faith, into perseverance, into the reminder that truth was worth defending no matter the cost, and how, before they said goodbye, Charlie had ended with the words, "Stay strong, brother. God's not finished with you yet." The tears came again, but Keanu didn't stop writing. Each word felt like a thread weaving together grief and memory, prayer and hope. It was not just preparation for a tribute. It was communion with Charlie, with God, with the people who were waiting for his voice. When his hand finally stilled, he exhaled deeply and set the pen down. The page was filled, the ink smudged by his tears. He read the final line aloud, his voice breaking. "Charlie, you will never be forgotten. Not by me, not by the millions who carry your light." The pages of the journal were no longer empty. They carried fragments of memory, lines of prayer, and pieces of a tribute that felt both unfinished and eternal. Keanu sat staring at the ink, his chest rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. Outside, dawn was just beginning to edge its light through the curtains, painting faint streaks of gray across the room. The long night had become morning, and with it came the realization that the time to speak was drawing closer. He turned the slip of calm, paper with the psalm over in his hand, running his thumb across the creased surface. It had survived years in his wallet, a constant reminder of comfort. But tonight, it felt like more than comfort. It felt like an anchor. He read the verse again and whispered it aloud. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." The words settled over him like a blanket, steadying the storm inside his chest. Keanu pushed the journal aside for a moment and closed his eyes. He pictured Charlie's face clearly, not the image of him on stage or in the spotlight, but the one he had seen so many times across a dinner table, laughing with ease, listening with full attention. That memory reminded him that this tribute wasn't about grandeur or perfection. It was about friendship. It was about love. It was about faith. He opened his eyes again and whispered to the empty room, "Charlie, you'd tell me to just be myself. You'd tell me that honesty matters more than polished words. So that's what I'll give them. Just honesty." The phone buzzed on the table again, another wave of messages he couldn't bring himself to read. He didn't need them. The message he needed was already written in his heart, carried there by years of brotherhood and faith. What mattered now was finding the courage to release it, to let the world share in the grief he could no longer contain alone. He placed his hand over the journal and bowed his head once more. "God, let this be more than my words. Let it be your comfort. Let it be the strength Charlie gave me, now given to everyone who needs it." His voice trembled, but there was resolve in it now. When he lifted his head, something had shifted. The doubt was still there, but it no longer controlled him. The fear of stumbling, the weight of expectation, all of it had been transformed into a responsibility he was ready to bear. He wasn't preparing a performance, he was preparing a prayer. And prayers, he knew, didn't have to be perfect, they just had to be true. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the curtains, Keanu closed the journal. The tribute was not finished on paper, but it was alive in his heart, and soon he would share it. The announcement came without fanfare, without press conferences or studio lighting. A simple message appeared across platforms. Keanu Reeves will speak tonight. The words spread like wildfire, carried from one phone to another, whispered in homes, shared in group chats. By the time the live stream link appeared, millions were already waiting, their screens open, their hearts pounding, with a mixture of grief and expectation. The digital room filled instantly. Families huddled on couches, college students crowded around laptops, strangers stood shoulder to shoulder at candlelight vigils with their phones raised high. The usual chaos of social media, the endless noise of opinions and debates, grew still. A rare silence spread through the digital world as everyone waited for one man to appear. The screen flickered, then steadied. There was no stage, no podium, no polished Hollywood backdrop. Instead, Keanu sat in a plain wooden chair, the walls behind him bare. He wore a simple black shirt, his hair falling naturally around his face. There were no bright lights to hide the exhaustion in his eyes. They were swollen from tears, the skin beneath them shadowed from a night spent in prayer and writing. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He simply sat there, breathing, his hands gripping the sides of the chair, as though anchoring himself against the tidal wave of emotion pressing in. The silence was heavy, but it was not empty. It was filled with a raw humanity that pulled viewers closer to their screens. Finally, Keanu lifted his gaze. His voice was low, trembling, almost breaking. "The brutal murder of my friend Charlie Kirk, it's an act of pure evil." The words struck like a bell ringing across the nation. Households grew stiller. Vigils fell completely silent. Even anchors on live television broadcasts stopped mid-sentence. It was not the tone of an actor delivering lines. It was the voice of a man shattered, struggling to breathe through his own grief. That authenticity gripped the country in a way no prepared speech ever could. Keanu paused, pressing his lips together, trying to steady himself. His chest rose and fell as he inhaled slowly, the weight of the moment almost too much to bear. But then he continued, his words halting but unflinchingly honest. Charlie was more than a leader. He was more than a public voice. To me, he was a brother, a man of faith, a man of courage, and a man who gave hope when the world tried to take it away. The camera caught every flicker of pain across his face, every tremor in his voice. And in homes across America, people wept with him. They did not see a movie star. They saw a friend, grieving openly before the world, his heart laid bare. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together tightly. "I have spent the last hours trying to find words," he admitted. "But words feel so small compared to the size of this loss. And yet, I know I must speak, not for myself, but for Charlie, for his family, and for every person whose life he touched." A hush lingered as his words flowed slowly, each syllable carrying the weight of lived pain. The nation, already broken, leaned in even closer. For the first time since the tragedy, people felt not just leadership or determination, but shared humanity. Keanu was not speaking at them, he was speaking with them. Keanu's eyes lowered for a moment, his fingers tightening together as if he were holding on to Charlie's memory itself. When he looked back up, his voice was steadier, though still marked with grief. Charlie believed in the power of truth, even when it cost him everything. He wasn't afraid of tough questions. He wasn't afraid of standing alone. And now, even in death, he's reminding us that courage matters more than comfort. The words carried like a quiet fire through living rooms and vigils across the nation. Some people whispered them aloud, repeating them like a vow. In churches where groups had gathered to watch the live stream, heads bowed in reverence, as if Keanu's sorrowful words were part of a prayer service. He leaned back slightly, his breath shuddering. "I don't speak tonight as an actor or a man known for films. None of that matters. I speak as a friend who has lost his brother. I speak as someone who doesn't have all the answers, but who knows that Charlie's faith was not in vain." His voice caught, and for a brief moment he stopped, his lips trembling. Charlie believed God was with him, no matter the storm. And I have to believe that now he is home, at peace, with the Lord he loved. Tears slid down his face, and he made no attempt to hide them. The camera stayed fixed, unflinching, as America witnessed his vulnerability. His tears became the nation's tears. Keanu reached for the journal on the table beside him, the worn leather still damp from the night before. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the shaky handwriting. "I tried to write something worthy of him," he said softly. "But what I wrote became less of a speech and more of a prayer." He looked up, his eyes glistening. "And maybe that's all this needs to be. A prayer for a man who gave so much, and a prayer for a country that now feels lost without him." He closed the journal again, without reading it aloud, as if the words were too sacred to share fully. Instead, he placed his hand over it and whispered, "Charlie, you will never be forgotten." For a moment, silence filled the feed. Millions of viewers sat with him in that silence, no one daring to interrupt. Then Keanu lifted his head, his voice gaining strength. "Evil may think it can silence a man like Charlie Kirk, but it cannot silence the truth he lived for. It cannot silence faith. It cannot silence love. His light doesn't end here. It continues in every person who chooses courage over fear, faith over despair." The weight of those words settled deep in the hearts of everyone listening. Parents held their children closer. Strangers reached for one another's hands at vigils. In dorm rooms and living rooms, people whispered, "Yes, that's true." Keanu drew in one last breath, his voice quiet again but firm. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, but I know Charlie would tell me strength doesn't come from us alone. It comes from God. And so tonight, I pray that God gives us all the courage to carry Charlie's light forward." He bowed his head, and for several long seconds, the only sound was his breathing. Then, without another word, the screen went dark. The live stream was over, but its impact had only begun. The moment Keanu's words began to flow across the airwaves, something remarkable happened in America. Families that had been bustling through dinner only minutes earlier sat frozen in their living rooms, forks resting untouched on plates, eyes locked on television screens. Children leaned against their parents, sensing instinctively that this was no ordinary broadcast. Mothers dabbed tears with napkins. Fathers gripped the arms of their chairs, swallowing the tightness in their throats. The stillness that settled over these homes was heavy, but it was not suffocating, it was sacred. In college dorms, the usual noise of music, laughter, and late-night chatter faded into silence. Students crowded around laptops and phones, some sitting on beds, others standing shoulder to shoulder in narrow spaces. These were the same students who had spent countless hours debating Charlie Kirk's ideas, some in agreement, others in fierce opposition. But in that moment, none of that mattered. They were united not by ideology, but by grief. When Keanu's voice cracked with sorrow, heads bowed instinctively, and a few whispered Amen, even if they had never prayed before. Churches across the nation had opened their doors late into the night. In small towns, pastors set up projectors against sanctuary walls, broadcasting the live stream as though it were a service. Wooden pews filled with families, elderly couples, and young children who clutched candles in their hands. When Keanu's words about faith rang through the speakers, the sound mingled with the soft sobs of congregants. Some knelt at the altar. Others stood with hands raised, whispering prayers aloud. For many, it felt as if the grief of a nation had been lifted into the presence of God, carried by Keanu's trembling voice. Even in city streets, where vigils had formed on courthouse steps and in public squares, people stood shoulder to shoulder, in front of giant screens set up by local communities. The cold air carried their breath as they listened, candles flickering against the night sky. Strangers who had never spoken to each other before wiped tears from their cheeks, sharing tissues and clasping hands. When Keanu paused, the silence that followed was deeper than any speech. People wept openly, the kind of weeping that comes from a wound too fresh to hide. Social media, so often a battlefield of division and anger, became something else entirely during the broadcast. The usual storm of arguments grew quiet. Instead, millions of posts appeared with single words, "Amen, brother, light." People who had never agreed on anything found themselves writing the same phrases. Their hearts moved in the same direction. Clips of Keanu whispering, "Charlie was my brother," spread across platforms, replayed endlessly, each viewing reopening tears, but also rekindling reverence. It was not only Christians who felt the weight of the moment. Across cultural and political lines, Americans recognized the authenticity of his grief. A Muslim shop owner in Detroit posted a video of himself watching the stream in silence, tears rolling down his face. A Jewish family in New York shared images of their Shabbat table where the broadcast played on a laptop beside the candles. An atheist blogger wrote simply, "I don't pray, but tonight I feel like I should." Keanu's voice had cut through the noise of ideology and landed directly in the human heart. People weren't hearing an actor. They were hearing a man who had lost his brother, and through that honesty, they heard themselves. For the first time in years, America felt less like a fractured land and more like a family gathered around a single grief, holding one another through the storm. Newsrooms across the nation fell still as the live stream continued. Reporters, trained to speak without pause, found themselves speechless. Anchors who normally filled every silence with commentary instead sat with damp eyes, their effing it. Voices cracking as they repeated only fragments of Keanu's words. One anchor whispered on air, almost forgetting the cameras were rolling, "I've never seen anything like this. He's carrying the grief of a nation." Viewers watching at home nodded, whispering back, as though in conversation with her. In Washington, politicians who had been preparing their own statements paused mid-sentence as aides played the broadcast for them. For once, the rehearsed lines and polished phrases were set aside. Senators and congressmen sat quietly in their offices, tears streaming down faces not used to public vulnerability. One lawmaker later admitted that, in those moments, he felt less like a politician and more like a grieving father watching another man express what he himself could not. At airports, travelers clustered around terminal screens, luggage abandoned at their feet as Keanu's trembling voice carried across waiting areas. Strangers who might otherwise have hurried past each other stopped to listen together. A young soldier stood rigidly, eyes locked on the screen, while an elderly woman beside him leaned gently against his arm. Neither spoke, but both cried silently until the broadcast ended. In hospitals, nurses paused their rounds, leaning on counters to catch fragments of the tribute. Patients who could sit up asked for their televisions to be tuned in. In one children's ward, staff gathered the kids in the common room. Many were too young to know Charlie Kirk, but they understood loss. And as Keanu spoke of faith and brotherhood, tiny voices whispered, "Amen," their eyes fixed on the screen with solemn reverence. Even those who had disagreed most with Charlie found themselves disarmed. A professor in Boston, long critical of his politics, confessed in a blog post afterward, "I didn't agree with him, but no man deserves what happened. And no grief has ever felt as real to me as the grief I saw in Keanu Reeves's eyes tonight." That post spread quickly, shared by thousands who felt the same shift in their own hearts. In small towns, bells rang from church steeples when the broadcast ended, not in celebration but in mourning, echoing across empty streets like a collective sigh of sorrow. In big cities, car horns fell silent. Traffic lights turned without their usual clamor, as though even the noise of daily life paused in reverence. For one night, America was not divided into red or blue, believer or skeptic. It was a nation bowed together, grieving with one voice. And when Keanu's words finally ended, the silence that followed was not emptiness, it was reverence. It was the sound of millions holding their breath, whispering prayers, clutching loved ones tighter. Some wept openly, some folded their hands. Some simply sat in stillness, their hearts joined in the quiet realization that they had all witnessed something sacred. For the first time in years, the country felt whole, not because wounds had healed, but because they were being shared, and in that fragile unity, America found strength. Keanu sat with the journal still beside him, but now he no longer looked down at the pages. His eyes lifted toward the camera, his voice soft, his tone carrying the fragile weight of memory. I want to tell you who Charlie was to me. Not the speeches, not the crowds, not the headlines, but the man I knew when the cameras were gone. He drew in a long, steadying breath. There were nights when I was alone, when the weight of this world pressed harder than I could carry. Nights when the silence of my home felt too loud, too empty. And without fail, Charlie would send a message. Simple words, never long, never elaborate. Just, "You're not alone. Keep going, brother." Sometimes, that was all it took. A few words that reminded me someone was praying for me. Someone was watching out for me. His voice faltered, his lips trembling as he pressed his hands together. I saved every one of those texts. They were light in the darkness. And now, reading them again, they mean more than ever. The memory brought tears to his eyes, but he didn't look away. He leaned forward slightly, as if speaking directly into the hearts of those watching. Charlie had this way of knowing when you were at your lowest. He didn't need you to explain. He just knew. And he always responded with faith. Always with encouragement. That's who he was. He paused, his chest rising with another unsteady breath, before moving to another memory. I remember a dinner we shared, away from cameras, away from attention. It was quiet, just a few of us at a table. I had spoken about worries I carried for my family, fears about the world they would inherit. I expected him to offer advice, maybe a story. Instead, Charlie put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Let's pray for them right now." Keanu's eyes glistened as he recalled the moment. He prayed over my family like they were his own. He prayed for strength for them, for peace, for protection. And he did it with such sincerity that I felt the room shift. I'm not a man easily moved to tears in public, but that night I couldn't hold them back because I knew those weren't just words. He meant every one of them. He let the silence linger for a moment, allowing the memory to sink in for both himself and the millions listening. That was Charlie never waiting for the right stage, never needing the perfect setting. If you needed prayer, if you needed love, he gave it right there, right then, without hesitation. His voice grew softer, the words slowing as he spoke of their last conversation. The last time we talked, it was late. We were laughing at first, just silly things, jokes, even memes we sent back and forth. But before we said goodbye, his tone changed. He said, "Never stop fighting for truth, brother. Promise me you won't stop." Keanu swallowed hard, his voice breaking into a whisper. Those were the last words he ever spoke to me, and they'll stay with me forever. Keanu closed his eyes briefly, gathering himself as though the weight of those final words pressed down on him even now. When he opened them again, his gaze was steady, but his voice remained tender. You know, in this world, friendships can be fragile. People come and go, circumstances change, fame complicates everything. But Charlie was different. He didn't care about what I had achieved or what my name meant to others. He cared about my soul. He cared about whether I was holding on to hope. Because when someone looks past the world's noise and sees you the real you, that kind of friendship changes you forever. The memories flowed out of him now, unguarded. He spoke of car rides where Charlie would sing along loudly to old country songs, not caring how off-key he was. He told of late-night phone calls where they'd argue passionately about ideas but always end in laughter. He described how Charlie never left a conversation without saying, "I'm praying for you." These little habits, small and ordinary, were what made the loss unbearable. Keanu's eyes filled again as he leaned closer to the camera. I know many of you saw Charlie as a leader, a fighter, a voice for truth, and he was all of that. But I want you to know what I saw. I saw a man who remembered birthdays, a man who stopped everything to listen, A man who prayed over friends as though their burdens were his own. That's who I lost. That's who we all lost. The room was utterly still as he took another breath, his words trembling but sure. I keep thinking about those last words he gave me. Never stop fighting for truth. They weren't just meant for me. They were meant for all of us. Charlie lived with conviction, but he also lived with compassion. And if we want to honor him, we can't just fight loudly. We have to love deeply the way he did. Tears rolled freely down his cheeks now, his voice cracking as he pressed on. I never expected a brother like Charlie. But God gave me one. And losing him leaves a hole in my heart that will never fully heal. But maybe that's the point. Maybe that hole is a reminder of what mattered, of what was real, of the kind of love and faith that doesn't end when a life does. He sat back, exhaling slowly, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion yet filled with peace. I wanted to share these memories with you because Charlie was more than headlines, more than the noise of politics. He was a man of faith, a friend, a brother. And tonight, I ask you to carry these memories with me. Don't let them fade. Let them change you the way he changed me. For a long moment, Keanu's eyes glistened silently, the journal resting under his hand. And across America, tears fell not only for Charlie Kirk, but for the purity of a friendship that had revealed itself in its most vulnerable, unguarded form. Keanu's eyes lowered, his voice softer now, almost a whisper that carried across the silence of the broadcast. I keep thinking about a chair, he said, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the journal in front of him. At Charlie's table, there will always be a chair that should not be empty, a place where his laughter should echo, where his children should look and see their father smiling back at them. The weight of that image pressed heavily into the hearts of every listener. It wasn't about politics or speeches or even the tragedy of the moment. It was about a family robbed of its center, a home missing the sound of a father's voice. Keanu swallowed hard before continuing. I was with Charlie once at his home for dinner. I remember the way he sat at the table, the way he asked each of his children about their day, the way he looked at Erica like she was the most important person in the world. That's what I keep seeing now, the chair where he should be sitting, the chair that will sit empty tonight. His voice cracked on the word empty, and he stopped, pressing his fingers to his eyes for a moment. When he spoke again, the words came slowly, each one breaking through the grief. To Erica, to his children, I cannot begin to understand your pain, but I want you to know, your husband, your father, loved you with every breath he had, and his love does not end here. The camera caught the rawness of his expression, his lips trembling as he pushed through the moment. I promise you this, Keanu said, his tone shifting with quiet strength. Your father's light will not go out. We will carry it for him. His voice, his faith, his courage, they will live on in us. Across America, people leaned closer to their screens. Parents who had tucked their children into bed earlier that night now returned to sit at their bedsides, watching them breathe softly in their sleep. Husbands and wives turned to each other, holding hands more tightly than before. Strangers sitting in churches whispered the words along with him. We will carry it for him. The grief that had once felt crushing now began to transform. Keanu's words did not erase the pain, but they reframed it, reminding the nation that Charlie's absence did not have to mean the end of his influence. His chair might be empty, but his legacy would be shared by every person who chose to honor it. Keanu lowered his head again, and his next words came broken, almost inaudible. I think about his little ones growing up without their dad to guide them, and my heart breaks. But I know this nation will not leave them alone. I know the people of faith and courage who love Charlie will surround them, protect them, remind them every day who their father was. Tears streaked down his face as he closed his eyes briefly, his shoulders heavy. Then he lifted his gaze again, and though his voice trembled, his words carried a rising conviction. That empty chair will always hurt, but let it also remind us of the price of courage, the cost of truth, and the beauty of a life lived with unshakable faith. Keanu leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together tightly. "That chair," he whispered, "it doesn't just belong to Charlie's family. It belongs to all of us now. Because in every home, in every heart that longs for truth, there's an empty chair waiting to be filled by courage, by faith, by love. We cannot let it stay empty." The image spread like fire in the minds of listeners. Across the country, people pictured their own tables, their own families, and the faces of loved ones no longer present. The thought of Charlie's empty chair was not just his family's grief, it was America's. A collective reminder of what had been stolen, but also of what could still be carried forward. Keanu's voice trembled again, but he pressed on. "When I think of Erica sitting at that table, with her children, I think of the silence that must feel unbearable. But I also think of the voices rising across this nation tonight. Voices that promise to stand with them, to remind them that their father's legacy is not gone." His eyes glistened as he spoke the next words with raw conviction. "We will not let them face that silence alone. In living rooms, people spoke aloud without realizing it. We will carry it too." The words passed from one heart to another, whispered in kitchens, murmured in churches, spoken by strangers who had never met but were now united in grief. A father in Texas placed his hand over his son's shoulder and repeated them. A grandmother in Ohio wept into her hands as she whispered the same promise. Keanu straightened slightly, his chest heaving as he found the strength to continue. "The world may try to break us with violence, but it cannot take away the love we carry. Evil can take a life, but it cannot erase a legacy. It cannot silence faith. It cannot silence truth." He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in, then added softly, "Charlie's chair may be empty, but his light fills this nation tonight." The power of the moment was not in eloquence or polish. It was in the way his trembling voice carried honesty that no script could capture. For those watching, it felt as though the grief in their own homes had been named, as though someone had reached across the divide of loss to sit with them in silence and faith. Keanu pressed his hands against the journal once more, closing his eyes. "Erica, children, if you hear this, know that your father's life is not measured by his last breath. It is measured by every life he touched. And tonight, millions of us promise you his fight for truth, his love for his family, his faith in God. We will carry it with us." Across the nation, the whisper became a chorus. Quiet, unplanned, but real. "We will carry it too." Keanu lowered his head slowly, his long hair falling across his face as his hands folded tightly in front of him. The room fell into complete silence. The camera did not move. The stream did not cut away. Millions of people watched as a man bowed his head and said nothing. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Still, he did not speak. The silence grew heavy, almost unbearable. But it was not emptiness. It was reverence. In homes across America, families instinctively mirrored him. Fathers lowered their heads. Mothers closed their eyes. Children fidgeted for a moment, then stilled, sensing the weight of the pause. In churches, entire congregations stood frozen, heads bowed as one. Even in public squares where vigils had gathered, strangers fell into silence. Candles flickered in the cold air as voices faded away, replaced by the sacred hush of a nation waiting together. Nearly a full minute passed before Keanu finally lifted his face. His eyes were glistening, his breath unsteady, but his voice emerged low and solemn. "God," he whispered, "tonight, we come before you broken. We come before you with heavy hearts, carrying grief too large for us to bear alone. But we know you are near to the brokenhearted. We know you save those crushed in spirit." The prayer was not rehearsed, not polished. It was raw, trembling, almost childlike in its simplicity. "I pray first for Erica, for Charlie's children. Lord, wrap them in your arms tonight. Let them feel the love of a nation, but even more, Let them feel your love. Give Erica strength she doesn't know she has. Let the children see their father's courage reflected in the people who surround them. Protect them, provide for them, and carry them when the weight feels too heavy. Across the country, mothers whispered their own prayers for Erica. Fathers prayed for the children, and young voices softly added, "Amen," from living rooms and candlelit vigils. Keanu's prayer had become their own. His voice quivered as he continued, "God, I also pray for America. This nation is hurting, divided, wounded by violence and fear. Give us the courage to stand for truth, the strength to love one another even when it costs us, and the faith to believe that darkness cannot win. Remind us that courage is not just for leaders, but for all of us, in our homes, in our schools, in our churches, in our daily lives. Let Charlie's example ignite something in us that cannot be extinguished. The words carried beyond politics, beyond parties. They touch something deeper, the longing of a people for meaning, for unity, for hope. Those listening felt as though their own unspoken cries were being voiced aloud by a man they had trusted for years, not as an actor, but as a human being. Keanu paused, his breathing heavy. He pressed his palm against the journal on the table as though steadying himself on the memories written there. His next words came slower, softer. "And finally, Lord, I pray for my brother Charlie. I thank you for his life, for his faith, for his courage. I know he is with you now, free from pain, free from fear. Let his soul rest in peace, and let his light never fade from this earth. Help us to honor him, not just with words, but with the way we live." Tears slid down his cheeks as he closed his eyes again, his lips moving silently for a moment before his voice returned, breaking but resolute. "Into your hands we place him. Into your hands we place ourselves. Amen." And across America, millions whispered with him in unison, a single word rising from countless homes, streets, and churches. Amen. The word Amen rolled through the nation like a wave. It was not shouted, not staged. It was whispered in millions of voices at the same time, soft yet powerful, a chorus born of grief and reverence. In homes, parents bowed their heads lower, whispering it again. In churches, whole congregations echoed it, their voices rising together as if the flan walls themselves carried the sound to heaven. On city streets, at candlelight vigils, strangers murmured it in unison, eyes glistening in the glow of flickering flames. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. The divisions that had scarred the nation seemed to fade, replaced by a fragile but undeniable unity. Across different faiths, different communities, even those who rarely prayed found themselves moved to join. A Muslim father in Dearborn whispered his own prayer beneath the word. A Jewish mother in New Jersey added her voice, hands resting on her children's heads. An atheist in Seattle typed the word online, writing, "I don't pray, but tonight I whisper, Amen." Reporters covering the event found themselves unable to speak. Networks that normally rush to fill silence with commentary held back, airing the hush of the nation without interruption. Anchors wiped tears from their eyes, their voices breaking when they finally spoke again. One simply said, "I have no words." That was prayer in its truest form. In small towns, church bells began to toll slowly, one after another, marking the moment. In large cities, skyscraper lights dimmed as offices joined in silence. Even in hospitals, patients and staff paused, some reaching for hands, some folding their own. The sound of machines hummed in the background, but for those who could hear the broadcast, the whispered Amen was louder than anything else. Keanu kept his head bowed a moment longer after speaking the final word. When he finally lifted his face again, the tears still streaked his cheeks, but his expression carried something new: peace. His eyes met the camera as if he were looking directly into the heart of every viewer. He gave no speech to follow, no dramatic closing. He simply pressed his hand over his chest, nodded once, and the screen faded to black. The nation did not move immediately. People stayed in silence even after the broadcast ended, holding the moment like something too sacred to release. And when life finally stirred again, it did so gently, through hugs, through whispered prayers, through promises that the light of a man named Charlie Kirk would not be forgotten. Keanu lifted his head once more, and though his eyes were red and swollen, there was a new fire in his voice. The trembling grief that had marked his earlier words now gave way to something deeper conviction. His tone was firm, every syllable carrying weight. "Charlie lit a torch," he said slowly, as if carving the words into the hearts of his listeners. "They thought they could extinguish it, but tonight, millions of us will carry it." The words spread instantly across the nation. In living rooms and church pews, in dorms and city streets, people repeated them aloud, whispering at first, then, with growing boldness, "We will carry it." The phrase caught like a flame, passing from candle to candle, until the entire country seemed to glow with its light. Vigils, that had begun quietly with small groups, swelled into crowds. Candles lifted higher into the night sky as if answering Keanu's call. In New York City, thousands gathered in Times Square, their faces lit not by neon billboards, but by the flicker of candles. In Dallas, a stadium filled as families poured in, each carrying a single light. In small towns, parking lots became sanctuaries, strangers holding candles side by side, singing softly as tears streamed down their cheeks. The torch Keanu spoke of was no longer metaphor alone. It had become visible in the glow of flames rising across America. In every state, from coast to coast, the night sky was pierced with small points of light, uniting a grieving nation in defiance of despair. Social media lit up with the same force. Hashtags poured across screens within seconds. Number carry the torch, number Charlie lives, number we will carry it. Millions posted photos of themselves holding candles, standing with neighbors, kneeling in prayer. For once, the noise of online division fell silent under the roar of unity. Even those who had disagreed fiercely with Charlie's politics added their voices. One post read simply, "I never agreed with him, but I'll honor his courage. We must carry it forward." Keanu leaned closer to the camera, his voice strengthening as the movement spread in real time. You cannot kill truth with bullets. You cannot bury faith with violence. You cannot silence love. Charlie's light burns brighter tonight than it ever has before, because it lives in every one of you who refuses to let it die. Across the nation, tears gave way to resolve. People who had once felt powerless now stood straighter, as if reminded of their role in something greater. It was not about one man's death anymore. It was about what he had stood for and what they could continue to stand for. The torch was no longer Charlie's alone. It had become the nation's. The images from across America poured in almost immediately. News channels that had prepared to analyze Keanu's words instead switched to live feeds of candlelight vigils springing up in cities and towns. Drone cameras hovered over public squares, capturing seas of glowing lights, stretching as far as the lens could reach. The sight of thousands of candles lifted together became the living embodiment of the torch Keanu had spoken of. In Chicago, a group of college students stood on the steps of their library, raising candles while chanting softly, "We will carry it." In Atlanta, church choirs led hymns in the open air, their voices blending with the flicker of candlelight. In Los Angeles, families gathered on beaches, the waves crashing softly behind them as they knelt in sand with candles pressed into the ground. The imagery was overwhelming. An entire nation transformed into one vast vigil. Even abroad, the torch began to burn. In London, Americans living overseas gathered in front of the U.S. Embassy, holding signs that read, "Charlie lives." In Israel, a small group of students lit candles near the Western Wall. In South Korea, American soldiers stationed on base stood in formation with lights in hand, whispering Keanu's words into the night air. The movement was no longer bound by borders. It had become global. On social media, the hashtags took on a life of their own. Number Carry the Torch trended within minutes, followed by Number Charlie Lives. Posts flooded in from celebrities, pastors, athletes, and everyday citizens. A single mother in Kentucky posted a photo of her 2 children holding candles, writing, "Your father's fight continues in us." A truck driver in Montana uploaded a short video, his face lit only by the flame of a lighter, whispering, "We will carry it." Each post added fuel to the fire, creating an unstoppable stream of unity. Keanu's words echoed again and again as people quoted him. "You cannot kill truth with bullets. You cannot bury faith with violence. You cannot silence love." Those lines spread like scripture, printed on posters, shared in classrooms, painted on banners, repeated in hushed voices at candlelit circles. In one small town in Ohio, a pastor told his congregation that the torch was not symbolic only of Charlie's life, but of the responsibility each of them now carried. "A torch doesn't shine for itself," he said. "It shines to light the way for others. Tonight, we are that light." His words were met with weeping and applause, and outside his church, 100 new candles were lit. The movement grew with every passing hour. Where sorrow had begun the night, resolve was ending it. The empty chair that Keanu had described earlier was now joined by countless flames, as if the nation had collectively declared that darkness would not have the final word. Keanu's voice still rang in people's ears, strong despite the tears. He had started broken, trembling with grief. But now his words had become a call, and the nation had answered. The torch had passed, not to one leader or one group, but to millions of ordinary people who promised to carry it. And as the night stretched on, the glow of candles across America looked like stars fallen to earth. Each one a silent vow, a vow that Charlie Kirk's light, ignited in life and threatened by death, would never be snuffed out. Keanu leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped as if holding something too fragile to break. His voice grew quieter, more personal, carrying the weight of memories that had never been meant for cameras or headlines. "You all knew Charlie as a public figure," he said, pausing to steady himself. "But I knew him as a brother, and what I want to share tonight, it isn't about politics. It's about loyalty. It's about the small things he did when no one was looking." The room, though empty around him, seemed to hold the attention of the nation. People leaned closer to their screens, waiting for something intimate, something real. Keanu's eyes flickered with the same vulnerability that had marked his earlier words, but now there was a warmth returning, like light breaking through cracks in stone. "I remember one night," Keanu began softly, "when my sister Kim was in the hospital. It was late, and the doctors had delivered news that left me shaken. I didn't post about it. I didn't talk about it in interviews, but somehow Charlie knew." He swallowed hard, his voice trembling on the edge of the memory. "He called me out of the blue, and he didn't ask for details. He just said, 'Keanu, don't forget your family is your true north. Everything else can wait. Be there for them.'" The words hit heavy in homes across America. Parents watching their television sets or phones reached instinctively for their children, pulling them closer. Husbands and wives turned to look at each other, as though reminded of a truth they had almost forgotten in the rush of daily life. Keanu's gaze fell to the floor before lifting again. "He never bragged about being there for me. He never let it slip in conversation with others. He carried those moments quietly, the way a true friend does. He didn't want credit, he just wanted to make sure I remembered what mattered most." He shifted in his chair, his voice steadying as he recalled another memory. "Charlie came to one of my film premieres once. Not to walk the red carpet, not to meet anyone in Hollywood. He showed up afterward, at the quiet dinner I had with my family. He pulled me aside and said, 'I'm not here for the movie. I just wanted to make sure your sister is okay. And I wanted to tell you I've been praying for her.'" The simplicity of it struck the audience like a hammer against glass. In an industry obsessed with appearances, here was a man who avoided the spotlight, who stepped into the shadows just to offer a word of encouragement, a prayer whispered in sincerity. "He reminded me often," Keanu continued, his voice low but steady, "that fame fades, Applause fades. But family endures. He said to me, "Don't lose sight of that, Keanu. Your family is your compass. It will always point you home." In that moment, across living rooms and small-town churches, tears flowed freely. Fathers thought of the nights they had missed dinner because of work. Mothers remembered the times they had let distractions steal moments from their children. College students, sitting shoulder to shoulder in dorm rooms, felt the sudden urge to call home, to hear the voices of parents they hadn't spoken to in weeks. Keanu's voice broke as he added, "I never told him this, but those words saved me in more ways than I can count. Because every time I found myself drowning in the noise of this world, I'd hear his voice reminding me, 'Your true north is not the crowd, not the camera, not the critics. It's the people at your dinner table. Don't forget them.'" The nation wept with him, not because Charlie Kirk had been taken from them, but because in that moment, they realized what his friendship had given. A reminder that loyalty is not about speeches or slogans. It is about showing up quietly, faithfully, when someone needs you most. Keanu let the silence linger, his hands resting on his knees, the weight of the moment heavy in his chest. When he finally spoke again, his words carried a softer, almost reverent tone. "Charlie never treated me like the actor the world sees. He never cared about the fame, the headlines, or the Hollywood world I lived in. He saw me as a man trying to find his place, as someone who needed a brother. That's who he was to me." He paused, remembering another moment etched deeply into his memory. "I once invited Charlie to join me at a small family dinner. It wasn't a glamorous event, just a simple meal at my kitchen table. He bowed his head before eating and prayed, not for himself, but for my family. He prayed that I would always have the strength to protect them, to love them well. He didn't know it then, but that prayer carried me through some of the darkest seasons of my life." Viewers across the country felt the gravity of those words. Parents sitting in their homes reached across the table to hold their children's hands. Couples who had been distracted by their own worries sat closer together, reminded of the sacredness of loyalty and prayer. Keanu's voice grew steadier as he spoke of his final memory. "The last words Charlie said to me were not about politics, not about battles in the public square. He simply told me, 'Never stop fighting for truth, but don't forget your true north. Don't forget your family.' Those words haunt me now, but they also guide me. Because they weren't instructions from a leader. They were the parting words of a friend who cared enough to remind me of what mattered most." Tears filled his eyes, but there was strength in them now. That is what loyalty looks like. Not the loud promises shouted in crowds, but the quiet presence when no one else is watching. That is the kind of man Charlie was, and that is the kind of man I pray to be. Across America, people whispered back at their screens, "Amen." And in that whispered chorus, the nation saw not politics, but loyalty, humility, and the beauty of a faithful friend. The first candlelight vigils had begun quietly, but by the following evening, they had spread like wildfire across the nation. What started as small circles of mourners outside churches and schools grew into rivers of people walking together through city streets. Candles flickered in every hand, their flames glowing like stars that had fallen from the sky. In New York City, crowds filled Times Square, holding signs that read, "We'll carry it," and "Charlie lives on." The noise of honking taxis and flashing billboards was replaced by hymns sung in harmony, voices rising above the city that never sleeps. Police officers who had expected to maintain control found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder with marchers, candles in their hands, tears streaking their cheeks. In Dallas, strangers lined the streets, waving American flags while holding candles that illuminated their faces in the night. Farmers from rural towns walked beside students from universities, and pastors linked arms with those who claimed no faith at all. It was not politics that united them, but the shared grief of losing a man who had reminded them of their better selves. In Chicago, a march wound its way down Michigan Avenue. At one point, an elderly woman stumbled, and a young man she had never met caught her arm. She looked at him through her tears and whispered, "We'll carry it." The words had become more than a slogan, they were a vow. People repeated them again and again, each time with more conviction, as if speaking them out loud stitched the broken pieces of the nation together. Television networks aired live coverage without interruption. Anchors spoke in hushed tones, struggling to contain their emotions as they described the unprecedented sight. "We are witnessing something rare in our time," one anchor said. "This is not a rally, not a protest, not a campaign. This is America grieving together and perhaps finding itself again." Social media reflected the emirated same unity. Videos of the marches went viral within minutes. A clip of a Muslim teenager and a Christian pastor lighting each other's candles spread across platforms with the caption, "This is the America Charlie believed in." A photograph of two children holding candles in front of their school sign that read, "Truth lives here," was shared millions of times. In Los Angeles, where Keanu's words still hung heavy in the air, thousands filled the streets outside a small church. They walked slowly, some singing, some silent, but all carrying light into the darkness. When a man raised his candle high and shouted, "For Charlie!" the crowd responded with a single voice, "We'll carry it!" The chant echoed against buildings, rising like thunder and rolling across the night. The unity stunned the nation's leaders. Lawmakers who had spent years fighting bitterly over every issue now stood at vigils together, humbled by the power of grief. Governors from opposing parties walked arm in arm in public squares. Reporters who usually dissected every word found themselves simply nodding in silence, their microphones lowered, tears flowing freely. The flames of the candles lit more than city streets. They lit something in the hearts of millions who had long believed the country was too divided to ever come together again. In the glow of those lights, strangers became brothers and sisters, bound not by ideology, but by humanity, by loyalty, by this simple decision to carry a torch forward in honor of a man whose life had been cut short. From coast to coast, the movement swelled. In Boston, bells tolled from historic churches, their deep tones echoing over cobblestone streets as thousands walked in candlelit silence. In San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge shimmered under a line of marchers carrying lights across its span, the flames reflecting in the dark waters below. In Atlanta, a choir gathered outside the state capitol, their voices rising in gospel songs that carried for blocks, blending sorrow with hope. In small towns, too, the response was just as powerful. A farmer in Iowa cleared out his barn and invited his neighbors inside, where they lit candles and sang hymns until midnight. On a reservation in Arizona, elders and children gathered together, praying for peace as they passed a single flame from hand to hand. In the Appalachian Hills, families stood on their porches holding lanterns high, their silhouettes outlined against the night sky. The unity was not confined to big cities, it stretched into every corner of America. News cameras captured scenes of people embracing in the streets. Old wounds seemed to heal in the presence of flickering light. Veterans hugged college students, and union workers held hands with business leaders. Political arguments that had raged for years seemed irrelevant now. The crowd spoke one language, a language not of debate, but of shared humanity. Each whispered phrase of "we'll carry it" became a thread weaving the nation into one. Journalists, usually trained to maintain distance, found themselves openly moved. One reporter in Philadelphia, her voice shaking on live television, said, "I've covered protests, elections, and crises, but I've never seen this. I've never seen America come together this way." Behind her, a group of children held up candles, their small voices chanting the words that had spread from Keanu's tribute into every home. The world beyond America watched with awe. International media showed images of candlelit marches, describing them as a rebirth of American unity. In Paris, citizens held a vigil outside the U.S. Embassy, their candles spelling out the word freedom. In Sydney, crowds gathered at sunrise to light candles in solidarity, whispering the same words, "We'll carry it." Keanu, sitting quietly in his home as the vigils played across the television, saw the images with tears streaming down his face. He had spoken as a grieving friend, not a leader. Yet his words had sparked something larger than himself. Charlie's torch was not just alive, it was burning brighter than ever, carried by millions who refused to let it be extinguished. As the marches continued, one image captured the nation's heart. In Washington, D.C., thousands filled the National Mall, their candles glowing against the backdrop of the Lincoln Memorial. A child climbed onto his father's shoulders and raised his candle high. The crowd fell silent as the boy whispered into the microphone passed to him, "We'll carry it for Charlie." The words, spoken in innocence, rippled through the crowd like a wave, and soon tens of thousands were repeating them in unison. That night, America felt something it had nearly forgotten. Not the sharp sting of division, but the deep strength of unity. It was born not from politics or power, but from grief, loyalty, and the enduring hope that even in tragedy, light can rise. And as the last candles flickered against the dark, the promise remained steady. A nation wounded, but not broken. A nation determined to carry the torch. The night was still. The nation had grown quiet, as though holding its breath. Keanu remained seated in the plain wooden chair where his tribute had begun. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, yet he found the strength to lift his eyes toward the camera one final time. His face was etched with grief, but also with something deeper, an unshakable resolve. The tears streaking his cheeks glistened in the faint light, and when he finally spoke, his words came out not as a performance, but as a whisper of truth carried straight from the heart. "Charlie," Keanu said softly, his voice breaking, "my brother, you ran a good race. You gave everything you had, and more. Rest now. We'll take it from here." The simplicity of the words cut through the air like a blade. Across living rooms, college dorms, and quiet church sanctuaries, people felt the finality of them. The man who had been a friend, a fighter, and a light, had reached the end of his journey. Yet in Keanu's trembling vow, there was the promise that his mission would continue, carried forward by those left behind. He paused, leaning back slightly, letting the silence stretch. Silence, in this moment, said more than speeches ever could. The nation leaned into that silence, feeling it settle into their bones. For a moment, it seemed as though time itself had slowed. The world watched a grieving man whisper a farewell to his brother, and in doing so, they felt as if they too were part of that sacred exchange. Keanu closed his eyes briefly, gathering himself. When he opened them again, they shone with something fierce and unspoken determination. "You showed me," he whispered again, "that faith and friendship are stronger than hate. You reminded me that even in the darkest nights, the torch of truth still burns. Tonight, that torch is not in one man's hands. It belongs to all of us." As his words spread across television screens and live streams, people nodded, their lips trembling with agreement. The collective grief that had blanketed the country all week was shifting into something else. Not anger, not despair, but purpose. A conviction to live with the same courage and loyalty that Charlie had embodied. Keanu let out a deep, shaky breath and lowered his head. "Thank you, brother," he whispered. The words barely audible but powerful enough to ripple through every home. "Thank you for teaching me what matters most." He did not try to wipe away the tears that continued to fall. He let them flow freely, because they were not just his, they were the tears of a nation, carried on his shoulders in that moment. The camera remained fixed on him, capturing not a star or a celebrity, but a man whose heart had been cracked open for the world to see. He leaned slightly forward, his voice steady despite the grief still pressing against his chest. "If you believe faith and friendship are stronger than hate," he said, "share this incredible story. Let the world know that light will always be stronger than darkness." His eyes softened. "And tell me," he added, the weight of his gaze pulling viewers in as if he were sitting across from each of them, "what torch will you carry in your life? What truth, what love, what faith will you hold high, even when the night feels dark?" He waited in silence again, as though listening for answers, as though the voices of millions whispering back to him could somehow reach across the distance. The stillness that followed was not empty. It was sacred. The feed held on his face for several more seconds. No music, no applause, just the raw humanity of grief, loyalty, and the promise of hope. Then, slowly, the screen faded into black. The black screen lingered. For several seconds, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, no distraction. Just silence. It was the kind of silence that wrapped around a nation, the kind that forced people to stop, to breathe, to reflect. In that silence, people at home whispered their own promises. A father sitting at his kitchen table with his teenage son said quietly, "We'll carry it." A young mother holding her baby close kissed her child's forehead and whispered, "You're my torch." In church basements, college dorms, and crowded apartments, the silence became a vessel for vows, spoken and unspoken. When the stillness finally released, the power of Keanu's final words continued to echo. He had not delivered a grand speech or a political charge. He had offered something far greater, a blessing, a challenge, and a reminder of what mattered most. The world had watched a man stripped of all polish and pride whisper to his brother in faith. And in doing so, he had given permission for millions of others to whisper back to their own loved ones. On social media, the call to action spread rapidly. The phrase "faith and friendship are stronger than hate" appeared on timelines and in hashtags. The words "What torch will you carry?" became a question shared in classrooms, at workplaces, and in living rooms. People began answering with their own stories. Some spoke of carrying the torch of kindness. Others pledged to carry the torch of forgiveness, of unity, of prayer. The incredible story of Keanu Reeves's prayer for his friend had transformed into something larger than a single moment. It had become a mirror, forcing each person to see themselves and to ask, "What will I carry? What light will I hold? What legacy will I leave?" And so, as the screen faded into blackness and the silence lingered, the invitation remained. If you believe faith and friendship are stronger than hate, share this incredible story and tell us, what torch will you carry in your life? The night closed on that question, and across America, millions whispered their answer into the dark.